So, as I mentioned, going to start working on the headrest. Now, as you've seen, I've already welded in the side rails here, so that's going to give me a place to put the seat on and then wrap the seat. I've already done, obviously, in the back, and you saw that in the previous video. So I'm all ready to go as far as the seat is concerned, and again, I'm not going to bother fitting all of that yet. When it comes to the headrest, as I mentioned before, what we need to do is we need to take this apart, use these as a template, cut out the new material, and then stitch the material. So the first thing you're going to want to do is you're going to actually want to mark these. Obviously that's the front, and then if that's the front, then this is the left piece, and if this is the left piece, then this is the right piece. Now it does have a stitch along the top so that there's actually a rear piece. I have to write rear because there's an R for right, but like I said, it doesn't matter because you can tell right away it's the back piece. But the key is I may not put that seam in. I may just use this, not cut this, and create a piece that will just wrap around. Actually, I got to check what I did on the other side to make them the same, but either way, I may or may not do that. Now, there's something else you have to do that's really important, because once you take this apart, you lose some of the orientation, is take a mark and drag it across the corner like that. You see, and again, I'm going to do the same thing on this side, just drag it across, drag it across, drag it across. The reason you're doing that is once I cut the new pieces, I can then mark them with this same mark so that when I bring the new pieces together, they will, be oriented right. Because remember, this piece can rotate because it will be separate, and unless it's correct, you're not going to get the appropriate design. You see how that shape is. So like I said, key number one is to mark all of the pieces, mark the orientation, and that makes it a lot easier. So some of you might be asking, where am I getting the material to create the headrest? And what I did is, this is the tonneau cover. This is a convertible, right, obviously, so it comes with the tonneau cover. The color of the tonneau cover is the same color as the interior, so again, that works well. And I sacrificed it. Now, that meant I already cut out the other half, which is I had used for the other side. Here I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to cut out all of the pieces, and good news is that I have a back and a front, so I have a lot of fabric to salvage. So I'm going to cut all this out really cleanly so I get good solid pieces, and then I'll make sure that all of my templates fit on this first before then cutting out the templates, right? Trying to use as much real estate as possible. So if any template fits into another, like a jigsaw puzzle, use that because you're going to want to save this. Now, yes, I sacrificed this, and why? Because I can't get any parts anymore, right? Being up in Canada and the borders are closed. But I had this, and it's a $40 part, right? It's a $40 part, so why not, right? I'll just order a new one when they finally open the borders, and I'll get a new one. I'm far from using it. I mean, it'll be a long time before I need this, but I need this right now because I'm working on it over the wintertime. So that's where I got my fabric. It might be a way for you to get it as well. I don't know if I can find this material anywhere. I mean, it's very specific, but this way here is perfect for what I need it for. So, using a razor blade, obviously, I trimmed all the way right along the edges to get the maximum amount of material off of the piece. So like I said, I've got some good pieces here. This will work, obviously, but I do want to still be very conscious about leaving as much of this material as possible, because as I mentioned before, the bottom or the seat part, I need to stitch some of this in to extend it to wrap around. It never reaches right around because the old seat simply disappeared around the back, and then the back just kind of snapped back and forth. There was a release, so there was two separate independent pieces and they were wrapped individually, where this is more of an amalgamation of a backrest and also a seat, and it needs to wrap around some of that mechanism, so I need to lose some of this as well. But as I said earlier, this part here now is simply disassembling it, cutting the stitches as I showed you before. You know how you can cut the stitches out so that you leave the pieces intact. Don't cut them, cut the stitching. That'll give you the individual templates, and that way there then I just lay the templates out on here, mark them and cut them, and that way there I get the appropriate pieces I need to stitch this back together. Okay, so let's take the headrest apart. first off, underneath what they did is they just use a clip. So this clip locks it in place. I'm not going to use the clip. I just stitched it along the bottom, made it a lot easier. Second thing I checked on is I did not cut the top of my other headrest. So this is one solid piece on the other headrest. So when I do take this apart, I will take the stitching out on the sides to remove the side panels, but I won't remove the stitching. I'll just use the entire piece as a template, and that way there, when I get my new piece on, I'll just simply use the whole thing and I won't have a stitch. Again, the more stitching you do, the more chance of something going wrong. So the best way to take this apart is to lock it in the vise so that you can really get a good grip on it to pull it apart. So let's lock it in, and then let's start pulling it apart. Okay, so it's locked in the vise. There is no easy way. I mean, the thing is this is really fit here. And I think what they used to do in the factory when they put these together is they use a vacuum system to kind of shrink the foam and then put this on top. So the only way you're going to get this off is you're going to have to peel it. And by taking your thumbs and pushing it in, I'm going to try to peel this like a banana. You see and how I'm going to start to bring this up. And I can only do that again. And the way to do it is you got to really push the foam in to get your hands around this thing. And this is tough. But you can see it is coming off. And like I said, it is like a banana. That was hard. I'm a little out of breath. I literally had to peel this off. And now that I see this plastic here, I can tell what they do is they put this into a vacuum chamber. This plastic shrinks the foam, compresses the foam, and then they just drop this thing on. And then they lock it together at the bottom. Not as easy as you might imagine to take it off. And it's going to be tough to put on the other one. But remember, this one here, this is tightly stitched at the bottom because it only locks with this one piece. Mine, it's going to be a little looser. It goes on, and then I'm going to have to use a curved needle and kind of just stitch the bottom. And I'll show you that process. But here we are. We now have the template, and I'm going to literally cut the stitching around the sides, and that'll give me my pieces, and we'll go lay them out. So like I said, once you take the blade and you're able to get into the stitching, it actually starts to come apart. I can start to even pull it apart, and then, then a new stitch will catch. You just snap that stitch, and then you can do that again and again. And the same thing here, right? So right down the center where the two pieces have been connected, all I do is I cut those stitches, and you can see the piece just comes apart. Very simple to do. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to sit here and then, like I said, cut those stitches. But see, this is the key now. It's going to give me this template where I'm going to take this piece, and I didn't cut it, so obviously I can then open this up, and that'll give me my template piece, and then that'll be my template piece, and then I'll just lay it down on top of the fabric. Again, like a jigsaw, find the best use of that material because you're going to need every inch of it. And then we cut these templates out, and then we take it to the sewing machine. So let's do that next. So they're all cut out, like I said, fantastic. We know the orientation. We know that when we put this together, like I said, so there's the front, so this is the right. And we just make sure that when we stitch it all together that those line up, and I'll mark the new pieces so that way there we know the orientation, because if you start stitching this wrong, obviously there's going to be a problem. Also, as you can tell, this wraps around the back, and then this is the way they kind of connected the bottoms together. So what I'm going to do is when I cut this piece, obviously I'm going to leave the spacing on the side, but I'm also going to make it a little longer because I would rather cut some material off underneath than I would to have to, figure out that I made it too short. So let's put these on the templates and cut them out. So I've laid out all three pieces on the table now. Right away you can tell if I do not cut this is a rather large piece, and I only have that one piece of material here that will be able to compensate for the size of this. I would rather keep this together as one piece, like I said, eliminating this stitch, and just simply sketch it out that size. These other two pieces, I mean, they're relatively small. I'll be able to take them from a smaller piece, and that'll leave me all that material. As I said, I still need some material when it comes to extending the seat part in order to wrap around the mechanism. Now, another key thing is once you start working with the material that you want to use, No longer use markers. Don't use a marker. Don't use any ink-based tool, because eventually it will bleed through. I mean, if I take an ink marker and I mark the inside of the, as you see here, you know, this is just a pencil. This is fine. That'll never bleed through. You'll never see that pencil on this side. But if I use ink or a marker and then heat gets to it and water may get on it and it gets wet, it could actually leach and pull that black through, and it'll ruin everything. So use a pencil. Now, the second thing I'm going to suggest is that we know that the way this fits together is this butts right up against the other piece. So if I take this now and I trace this, right, and I trace it all the way around, that will only allow it to butt. You have to make sure you leave extra on top of that, because that's where you're going to stitch it. Now, to make it easier for you, and the way I found on the other one, is I am going to be very careful, and I'm going to mark this right along the edge all the way around this template. Then I'm going to come back, and then once I have a line in the template, I'm going to come back and draw a line, you know, let's say half an inch away, and then I'll cut that out. Now, if I do that consistently, if I can do that for all the pieces, that means when I'm sewing this together, if I keep the edges, and again, you're going to be sewing inside out, and I'll show you that trick, but I can keep the edges together and then stitch and use the line that I drew on the inside to stitch on. As long as I keep the outsides flush, that will give me the exact you know, stitch together that I need, right? So again, just letting you know, you're going to mark it, you're going to add that 1/4 inch or a 1/2 inch, whatever you want, but make sure if you add a 1/2 inch, add a 1/2 inch to all of them. And then that line that you had where you had put the original line, when you're sewing, the sewing machine will actually then use that line, and that way there it'll stitch the two together right where these would have been together. So that's the trick in putting one of these things together. So don't mind me, I'm going to mark these out. I'm then going to add my 1/4 inch or 1/2 inch, whatever I decide to do, and then I'm going to cut them out, and then I'll come back. Okay, so what I've done is I have traced this out. It's difficult to do because what you got to do is make sure the one side is good, and then without allowing it to move that much, you have to be able to get your hands down here to cut this one or mark this one. So what have I done is I've marked it. Now, before you do anything, you can see that I have the rear and the front. So this is going to be R and F. We're going to mark that because the orientation of this is different, because the headrest sticks out a little bit closer to the driver's head and it's flatter in the back. So you have to make sure you keep that orientation. The next thing I want to do is, once this is back aligned, and again I can just realign it here, there we go, is the reference marks I made earlier, I'm going to transfer them to the fabric, because I want to make sure that that reference mark and this reference mark, and then of course I had it on the other side as well, so what that does now is that gives me the reference marks that when I cut the other headrests out and they have their reference marks, when I'm putting this together I can align the reference marks with the other one, and then when I stitch, that will take care of making sure the orientation of the side pieces is right with this piece as well. And again, you're going to make sure you mark those left and right and all of that, so I'll be taking care of that. Now, as you can see, I have marked or traced the original trace. I'm now going to come back and I'm going to add my, and again, I'm just going to either eyeball it or I'm going to use a measure, and I'm just going to make this bigger and then cut the larger, and then I'll do that for the other two, and then I'll be back. Okay, this is going to be the hardest part to get your head wrapped around. So obviously we now have our old template pieces. I put them aside. I cut a lot of extra fabric at the end right? So this piece is a lot longer than the original piece, but again, you can cut material off. It is a lot harder to put material back on. Now, why were those reference marks so important that we put on? And that's because when we stitch this together, we're actually going to stitch this front to front like that. Because really what we're going to do is if we align these reference marks, so now we got the two marks aligned, right? There's one mark, there's the other mark. And then I can obviously also get the fabric the same width, right? Because again, if you cut extra the same amount, then that'll align. And I'm going to start to stitch along this line, because that line, the inside line, is the original dimension of the part, which means when it's stitched together, that will be then the same thing. It'll have that original dimension of the part. But as you see, as I start to stitch, that bottom piece starts to go away, right? So now you got to start to twist the piece as you're stitching it, because that's going to give you that rounded edge, right? And that'll eventually, when it flips inside out, will have a rounded edge on it as it's being stitched. And again, we're creating that rounded edge all the way around both sides. So remember, that's why the reference marks are there, because you don't know, where you're going to start to stitch. So the reference marks allow me now to take and that's the other thing too. This is the front, which means if you fold it over, I'm now looking at the front. Well, that's the right side of the front, which is the right side piece. So you have to make sure the orientation is correct. And again, that's why we had the reference marks properly, so that when we do stitch this together, it will be the appropriate design, because as you can see, right, it's a heavier curve at the front, a little smoother at the back, but that's because the headrest is further forward on the headrest. So next stop is the sewing machine. Now here's where it really starts to get tricky. So this is the front, correct? So this is the front. I had the F mark, so this is, my head will be, that'll be on the headrest. This is the right-hand side, correct? Because that's the front, that's the right side. To stitch this thing, we have to stitch it face to face, which means I got to flip this over. Now, as soon as I flip this over, got to remember that's the right side. So we're going to take the right piece onto the right side, and then what we're going to do is, that those marks I had made. So there's the mark on this side. There's the mark here. I'm going to align those two. And what we end up with now is a piece where I'm face to face, and I can start to stitch. But you're going to see what's going to happen. I can't just stitch around there. I have to start to move this piece in order to continue stitching along this line, but having these edges line up. And that's really starting to where the challenge is you got to start moving these pieces. So what I'm going to do, as I said, we take the original piece, we make sure that my reference marks are aligned. We make sure that we're aligned on the outside, because we cut these fairly the same. And the good news is the straighter part is a little easier, because both the bottom and the top have the exact same contour. So we'll be able to stitch that. But as soon as we start getting over the crest of the headrest, where it really starts to bend like that, that's when we really got to start moving this piece. So I'm going to take a stitch, we're going to run it up here until we get to the point where we start to diverge, where the secondary part starts to come away from the first part, and that's where we start. So let's get going. But basically, like I said, it's just a sewing machine, so it's going to start driving a stitch through. So when you first start sewing, what you do is you put in about 5 or 6 stitches, then you throw the machine in reverse. That'll then run it backwards to get 5 or 6 stitches in, and then we're able to then continue on, and that locks the first steps in. So let's get going. Okay, so that was the challenging part, right? Because what we needed to do was, as I was stitching this, so I started off in the rear, the right there, and started stitching it this way. As I started stitching it, I really had to start to bend the two pieces to keep the outside edge aligned, right? Because that's the outside edge, and there's the inside line, and I was stitching along the inside line. And what does that do? Well, when that you go all the way around, the other thing is you see my reference marks are matching up pretty good. So they were the ones, like I said, that I wanted to mark. But when you turn this now inside out, because you had to stitch it that way, and again, remember, this isn't stretched out at all, right? This is going to be stretched out over that frame. But basically, we now have the end of our, there it is. There's the right, there's the front, there's the right, and we now have a headrest that I'm going to be able to stretch over the foam. Just have to repeat it on this side here and just do the same thing, and then we'll be done. I'm not going to bother you with that. I'm going to stitch up the other side, and then we'll start to fit that on top of the headrest, so I'll see you then. Okay, the big machine is winding down, as you can hear. Like I said, it was a good investment. It was about $500, if I remember correctly, I paid for this thing. It was an end use. I mean, these are the kind of things that are more of a commercial grade rather than a home sewing machine, although a home sewing machine would do the same thing. But this one here, like I said, it's got a throttle that is clutch driven rather than the motor. Makes it a little easier to use, but unfortunately the motor spins up to full speed and then you just touch the clutch to engage the engine. So left side is now stitched in, right side is now stitched in. So again, you have to do it inside out. So now what we do is we turn it inside out. It's always hard to do when you're filming yourself, but we end up with the headrest. And like I said, so you can see it's got the taper in the back. That is the front. No, that is the rear. So there's the taper in the front. So like I said, that's why you mark it, right? You got to know what's front, what's back. And like I said, these seams will stretch out as soon as I get it over the foam, right? They'll pull on the stitching, and it'll reveal a nice stitch. The color I found in the blue is actually, I found a teal, which is very close to the color of this. So even if the stitches show, they blend right in. So next step is to take this and put it over the foam. And then, as I said, underneath here, I left a whole bunch of extra fabric. So I'm going to probably, you know, once we tuck it and roll it and fold it, we'll be able to stitch it up underneath, and you won't even see it because it'll be underneath the headrest. I'll meet you at the vise. Trying to get up close and personal, but also stay in frame. This is tough to do. So as we left it, here's our foam sitting in the vise. As I said, it really makes it a lot easier when this is solid. This is the front, right? Because remember, it leans forward. Right? So this is where your head actually hits. So inside we have our F marked. You can probably see the F. So this is the front. So this goes on the front of the unit this way. Now, what do you got to do? I guess we can start to stretch it on top. Now that plastic is actually kind of nice. It slides on as opposed to being foam to foam. So we're able to start grabbing this, pulling it down. And this is an initial fit. Now, like anything, you know, stitching is, you know, if I get a little variance off of that line, you know, we're going to get a little bit of extra play. So what can I do? I can stretch this down. Obviously, I've got lots of material down here to stretch this out, make it nice, but the sides aren't really, really good. So we'll put in our fiber fill. The fiber fill will take up any of the gap. It'll fill this unit up a little bit more and then make this actually a little bit more soft anyways, is what you want, right? Because your head's going to be against it. But there you go. I mean, quite literally, it's almost passable the way it is. You know, I don't like it, you know, because again, although I don't want perfect to be the enemy of good, I also still want this to look a little better than that. So I'm going to take this off. I'll put the fiber fill. We'll slide it back on with the fiber fill. We'll get this to fill up so that it stretches this a little bit better. So it's harder to put on. That was actually a little easy. We'll get this stretched out. and then like I said, all I got to do is trim underneath it and stitch it up, and we're ready to go. So like I said, I'm going to take this back off, get some fiberfill, put it on a few times. I'll show you the end result, but I'm not going to show you the process of me putting it on and off 15 times. I mean, that's pretty apparent what I'm doing. So I'll see you when I have this all set. Well, that was probably it. I mean, I just took some of that fiberfill, 2 layers thick, put it around, wrapped it around, and like I said, all I got to do now is kind of stretch this out a little bit more, but it's taken up all of that slack, right? So there's no slack in here anymore. Everything is solid all the way around. It's nice and cushy. So literally, as far as the headrest is concerned, like I said, I'm just going to stretch this out a little bit, let it rest a bit, and then what I need to do is simply take the 2 sides, tuck them together, stitch them up down the center. What I do with that, of course, is I bring in the side pieces as well, and then with the side pieces in, I can then stitch the whole thing across, and I just use the curved needle. So I just literally curve needle the whole thing all the way around, because this is going to be sitting on top of the chair anyways, so it comes down onto the chair, and you're not going to see that. So like I said, you're not going to see the stitching underneath. But that's it. That's how you create a headrest off of an existing pattern. Use it as a template, and then draw that outer line a little bit, about a ½ inch or 1/4 inch out, and then just make sure you do that consistently, and then you just stitch it and just make sure the outer lines stay the same. That's it. You've just now converted any seat you can buy out there to look and feel like a 1968 Mustang seat. Good luck with it, and like I said, if you have any questions, please let me know.